In the remote highlands where Scotland's heart beats most fiercely against the encroaching wild, the village of Gairlough was a mere whisper of civilization surrounded by the vast, unyielding wilderness of Eldermore. Here, under the shadow of ancient, towering pines and the watchful eyes of the mountains, the people of Gairlough lived much as their ancestors had, bound by the rhythms of nature and the cycles of the seasons. Alistair MacCrae had inherited a modest farm at the edge of the village, his land bordering the ominous thicket known as Eldermore Woods. The woods were ancient, far older than any living memory, and were thick with legends of spirits and creatures that moved in the shadows, their whispers woven into the night winds. Alistair, however, was a practical man, more concerned with the earthly challenges of farming than the ghostly tales told by firelight. Winter had arrived early that year, blanketing the land in snow and sealing the earth with frost. It was during these biting cold months that Alistair first noticed the peculiar disturbances. One morning, as the pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, he found the barn door ajar and the ground outside trampled with unfamiliar prints, large and ragged, unlike any beast he knew. Over the following weeks, the situation worsened. A cow was found one frosty morning, lying dead near the forest's edge. Its body was a grotesque spectacle, mangled and torn as if savaged by a wild beast, yet there were peculiarities that puzzled Alistair, marks that seemed neither entirely animal nor human. The village elders spoke of the Morrighul in hushed tones, a creature of shadow and despair, said to dwell within the darkest depths of Eldermore. They warned that during the harsh winters, when food was scarce, it ventured close to human settlements, driven by a hunger as ancient as the woods themselves. Alistair was not easily swayed by tales of folklore, yet he could not ignore the unease that had begun to take root in his heart. Determined to protect his remaining livestock, he decided to keep vigil. Night after night, he watched from the shadows of his barn, the cold gnawing at his bones, the silvery moon his only companion. On one such night, under a sky cluttered with stars, the silence was broken by a rustling in the thicket. Straining his eyes against the darkness, Alistair saw them, eyes like coals smoldering in the dark, watching him from the edge of the woods. As quickly as they appeared, they vanished, leaving behind only the rustling of leaves and a cold dread that settled in Alistair's stomach. The next day, Alistair sought the counsel of the oldest among the village elders, old Mary, who had lived all her life by the lore of the land. Her cottage was perched at the northern end of the village, her rooms cluttered with jars of herbs and walls lined with books and scrolls of ancient knowledge. Mary listened intently to Alistair's account, her eyes narrowing with concern. It sounds much like the Morrighul," she said, her voice a whisper. "You've seen its eyes, and you've seen what it can do. It's no ordinary beast, Alistair. It's older than the woods it haunts, born from the darkness of the old world. But how can I protect my farm? My family?" Alistair asked, frustration lining his voice. "The old ways, the old protections," Mary replied, reaching for a dusty tome. She flipped through the aged pages until she came to a section marked with strange symbols. "Here, take this symbol, carve it into your barn, your home, anywhere you hold dear. It's a ward, old as the hills. It might keep the creature at bay." Alistair left Mary's cottage with a heavy heart, the tome tucked under his arm. He was not one to believe in such things, but the fear for his livelihood and the safety of his family gnawed at him. That night, under the light of a waning moon, he carved the ancient symbols into the wood of his barn, whispering hopes into the cold night air. As the days passed into weeks, the mysterious disturbances ceased, and a cautious relief settled over Alistair's farm. But the peace was short-lived. One morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Alistair awoke to an unsettling silence, a silence that spoke of a new, deeper darkness that had descended upon his land. The morning was unusually cold, with a biting wind sweeping down from the highlands that seemed to whisper of darker days. Alistair stood at the edge of his property, his eyes fixed on the ominous line where his land met the shadows of Eldermore Woods. The uneasy quiet that had settled over his farm was more unnerving than the rustling of unknown creatures in the dark. Resolved to seek further guidance, Alistair made his way to the village square where the elders gathered for their morning council. The square was a modest patch of ground, bordered by the stout, stone-built cottages of the villagers, and overlooked by the ancient oak that had stood watch over the community for generations. The elders, a collection of the village's most respected and seasoned individuals, sat on worn benches carved from the same oak, their faces etched with the wisdom and worries of many harsh winters. As Alistair approached, the conversation dwindled into a respectful silence. The eldest among them, Elder Hamish, beckoned him forward with a nod. Hamish's eyes were sharp, missing nothing, his white beard like the frosted moss that clung to the rocks of Eldermore. "Alistair MacCrae, what brings you to the council this brisk morning?" Elder Hamish's voice was steady, his tone conveying both concern and command. Alistair took a deep breath, his words carrying the weight of his recent troubles. "Elders, I've come seeking wisdom. Something prowls the borders of my land, taking livestock. I have seen its eyes, glowing like coals in the night, and I have found signs of its presence, marks that are neither beast nor man." Old Mary suggested it might be the Morrighul, he explained, watching the elders closely for their reaction. A murmur passed through the council, and several of the elders exchanged glances, their expressions grave. Elder Bridget, a woman whose knowledge of local lore was unrivaled, leaned forward, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "The Morrighul is no mere tale to scare children, Alistair. It is a relic of the old world, a creature that feeds on more than just flesh. It harbors a hunger for the spirit, the essence of life itself." Elder Connell, known for his skeptical nature, stroked his chin thoughtfully. "And yet, we must not jump to fear. Alistair, have you considered more earthly explanations? Perhaps a rogue animal, or someone's misguided jest?" Alistair shook his head, frustration lining his brow. "No jest would account for the horrors I've witnessed, Connell. And no animal I know leaves such marks, or vanishes into the night without a trace." Elder Hamish raised his hand, signaling for silence. "We will heed the signs, Alistair. Tell us, have you followed Mary's advice? Have the wards offered any protection?" "They seemed to, for a time. But this morning, the silence, it was as if the very soul of my farm had been sucked away. No sound of livestock, no birdsong, just emptiness," Alistair replied, his voice tinged with despair. Elder Bridget nodded solemnly. "It is as I feared then. The Morrighul does not relent easily. It tests the wards, searching for weaknesses, drawing strength from fear and uncertainty." The council fell silent, each member lost in their thoughts. Finally, Elder Hamish spoke, his decision born of many years facing the unknown. "We must act, not only for Alistair's sake but for the whole of Gairlough. I propose we consult the old books, gather the village at sundown for a rite of protection. Alistair, prepare your home. We will stand with you." Grateful and relieved, Alistair nodded, his resolve hardened by the elders' support. "Thank you, I will do as you say. Whatever it takes to protect my family, my home." As the meeting dispersed, the elders each murmured their goodbyes, their faces etched with the seriousness of their task. Alistair left the council with a heavy heart but a flicker of hope. That evening, the village of Gairlough would come together, united against the darkness that lurked in the whispering shadows of Eldermore woods. After the council meeting, Alistair returned home, his mind racing with the gravity of the elders' words and the task ahead. As he approached his farm, the silence that greeted him was palpable, a stark reminder of the eerie calm that had settled over his land. It was in this heavy quietude that Alistair made his way to the old stone shed at the back of his property, where his grandfather's artifacts were stored. The shed was cool and dim, the air thick with the smell of old wood and metal. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in the wooden walls, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. Alistair's footsteps echoed slightly as he moved towards the back where his grandfather's possessions were kept. These were items of both utility and mystery, each carrying stories of the old ways that his grandfather had passed down before his death. Among these artifacts was the blade, rumored to be forged with silver and bound by ancient rites. It was a large, robust sword with a handle wrapped in leather that had worn smooth over years of handling. The blade itself was etched with symbols that Alistair had often pondered over as a child. These markings were said to be of old magic, protective and powerful. Alistair lifted the blade, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. The cool metal seemed to thrum with a latent energy, as if it too sensed the impending confrontation. He set the sword on an old wooden table and began the careful process of cleaning and sharpening the blade. As he worked, he recalled the tales his grandfather had told him about the creatures of Eldermore, and the importance of being prepared both in spirit and in arms. As the edge of the blade began to shine, catching the light with every stroke of the whetstone, Alistair's thoughts turned to the preparation of his spirit. His grandfather had often spoken of the mental fortitude required to wield such a weapon, not just in battle, but in the presence of the dark forces it was meant to confront. Determined to fortify his resolve, Alistair left the blade on the table and walked over to a small, locked chest that sat in the corner of the shed. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, were his grandfather's journals. These were detailed accounts of the old man's encounters with the supernatural, along with notes on rituals and protective spells. Alistair spent the remainder of the afternoon poring over these journals, absorbing every word. He found a passage detailing a confrontation with a dark entity, and the ritual his grandfather had used to protect his home. It involved a series of symbols drawn in salt at the home's entrances and the recitation of an incantation at sunset. Feeling a renewed sense of purpose, Alistair stood and returned to the blade. He finished sharpening it, then carefully drew the same symbols from his grandfather's journal onto the blade's hilt using a small pot of black ink. Each symbol was a promise, a piece of ancient wisdom that he hoped would give him the edge he needed to face the Morrighul. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across his land, Alistair knew that time was short. He gathered the blade and the journals, and set about preparing his home as instructed. He sprinkled salt at every doorway, the grains crunching softly underfoot, and marked the lintels with protective sigils. By the time he had finished, night had fallen, and the air was alive with the whispered warnings of the wind. Alistair stood at the threshold of his home, the blade in his hand, and looked out towards the darkening woods. The night was still, but the silence no longer felt oppressive. Instead, there was a sense of readiness, a charged anticipation for what was to come. As the village bell tolled in the distance, marking the hour, Alistair tightened his grip on the blade's hilt. The night of confrontation was upon him, and he was as ready as he would ever be. As the village bell's final toll echoed into silence, Alistair took his first determined steps into the shadowy embrace of Eldermore Woods. The air was crisp, tinged with the sharp scent of pine and the cold bite of impending winter. Under the canopy of ancient trees, the daylight waned quickly, replaced by a dim twilight that barely filtered through the dense foliage. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, yet each crack of a twig underfoot sounded ominously loud to Alistair. He moved with purpose, his grandfather's blade held ready, its surface gleaming faintly in the sparse moonlight that managed to pierce the tree cover. He felt the weight of his ancestors' knowledge, both a comfort and a burden on his shoulders. As he ventured deeper, Alistair recalled the map sketched in his grandfather's journals, detailing the suspected haunts of the Morrighul within the woods. The creature was said to dwell near the heart of Eldermore, where the trees grew so close together that they seemed to form walls of wood and shadow. This place was marked on the map with warnings in old runes, suggesting a boundary not just of land, but of the realms of the known and the unknown. Navigating the thick underbrush and ancient, gnarled roots that seemed to grasp at his boots, Alistair felt the forest around him begin to change. The air grew colder, and the natural noises of the forest dimmed, as if the very woods were holding their breath. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, playing tricks on his eyes. Suddenly, a low mist began to curl around his feet, creeping silently across the forest floor. The mist was unnaturally cold, seeping through the fabric of his boots, chilling his bones. With each step, the mist thickened, rising to swirl around him, obscuring his path and dampening the sound of his movements. Alistair stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was no ordinary fog, it was a harbinger of the Morrighul's presence. The creature was close, perhaps watching him even now. He tightened his grip on the blade, readying himself for any movement in the fog. It was then that he heard it, a whisper, soft and sibilant, like the rustle of dry leaves. The voice seemed to come from all around him, echoing softly in the mist. "Who treads so boldly in my realm?" Alistair's voice was steady as he replied, "Alistair MacCrae, of the village at the edge of your woods. I come seeking peace for my land and safety for my kin." The whispering paused, and for a moment, the only sound was the beating of Alistair's own heart. Then it came again, closer this time, its tone mocking. "Bold, but foolish. Many have come, yet here I remain, and they do not." Alistair sensed movement in the mist, a shifting of the shadows. He swung the blade in a wide arc, its edge cutting through the fog, dispersing it momentarily. The air crackled with a strange energy, the blade humming as if resonating with some unseen force. "Show yourself, creature," Alistair called into the thickening mist. He knew that the confrontation was inevitable, and every tale and every piece of lore had led him to this moment, face to face with the ancient darkness of Eldermoor. As the mist gathered again, denser than before, a form began to coalesce, a figure tall and thin, wrapped in tattered robes that fluttered in the windless air. Its eyes glowed red in the gloom, fixing Alistair with a gaze that felt like it could freeze his soul. "Welcome to my domain," the figure hissed, its voice a chilling blend of malice and amusement. "Let us see if your blade is as sharp as your words, young MacCrae." With the Morrighul revealed, Alistair braced himself, his resolve hardened by the sight of his adversary. This was the moment his grandfather had prepared him for, the moment to stand his ground, to protect his family, and to face the dark heart of Eldermoor. The battle, he knew, was just beginning. With the Morrighul now looming before him, a sinister silhouette against the dense fog, Alistair felt an icy chill not solely from the mist but from the palpable malice radiating from the creature. Its eyes, burning with a deep, red glow, seemed to peer into his very soul, probing for weaknesses. But Alistair steeled himself, gripping the hilt of his ancestral blade with both hands, ready to defend his life and his land. "Your presence here violates the ancient pacts, creature," Alistair declared, his voice cutting through the heavy air with a resolve that surprised even him. "I stand here on behalf of Gerla, guardian of its people and defender against darkness. Withdraw, or face the consequences." The Morrighul laughed, a sound like the crackling of dry leaves mixed with the whispering winds. "Brave words for one so outmatched," it sneered. "But words will not save you here." In a flash, the creature moved, its form blurring into the mist. Alistair swung his blade in a wide arc, the motion honed by countless hours of practice on the farm, driven by the force of his will and the weight of his heritage. The silver-edged blade sliced through the fog, dispersing it momentarily, revealing nothing but the dark, dense woods behind. Confusion momentarily clouded Alistair's focus, but his grandfather's training took over. He remembered the teachings, that his senses must extend beyond the physical, that he must feel the environment, detect the slightest change in the air, the subtlest shift in the shadows. Closing his eyes briefly, Alistair expanded his awareness, tuning into the sounds of the forest, the slight movements of air, the earth beneath his feet. Suddenly, a slight disturbance to his left caught his attention. He turned just in time to parry a swift, shadowy strike that seemed to come from the mist itself. The impact sent a shockwave through his arms, but the blade held, an ancient barrier between him and the dark entity. "You are quick, human," the Morrighul hissed, now visible again as it recoiled from the failed strike, its form coalescing into a more humanoid shape, cloaked in tattered robes. "But how long can you last?" Alistair didn't respond with words but with action. He advanced, pressing the creature with a series of calculated strikes, each paired with a step that kept the Morrighul on the defensive. As he moved, he recited under his breath the incantations his grandfather had written about, spells of protection and strength, hoping their ancient power was real. The Morrighul seemed momentarily taken aback by this show of strength, its form flickering as if destabilized by the ancient words. It recovered quickly, however, and countered with a sweeping motion that sent a wave of cold, dark energy pulsating through the air. Alistair felt the energy wash over him, a coldness that threatened to sap his strength and darken his vision. But he focused on the warmth of the blood in his veins, the fire of his spirit stoked by the danger and the need to protect his family. Pushing through the cold, he met the Morrighul's next attack with the flat of his blade, turning it aside and forcing the creature back. The battle ebbed and flowed like a dark and deadly dance, with each combatant testing the other's defenses, seeking an opening. Alistair found that his physical prowess alone would not be enough. He needed to outthink and outlast this ancient foe. Just as the creature lunged, Alistair spotted a pattern in its movements, a reliance on sudden, direct attacks. Predicting its next move, he stepped aside at the last moment, allowing the Morrighul's momentum to carry it forward. Spinning around, he brought his blade down in a powerful arc, aiming for where the creature's form seemed most solid. The blade connected with a resounding clash, and the Morrighul staggered back, a screech tearing from its throat, a sound of anger and pain that echoed through the woods and sent shivers down Alistair's spine. "We are not finished yet," Alistair panted, watching warily as the creature regained its composure. The first encounter had tested him, drained him, but it had not defeated him. He knew now that he could hurt the Morrighul, and with that knowledge, his resolve hardened further. He prepared for the next phase of the battle, knowing that the true test of his courage and his blade's power was just beginning. As the battle wore on, the sky above Eldermore darkened to a deep twilight, heralding the full descent of night. The last rays of the sun flickered and died behind the towering pines, leaving Alistair and the Morrighul cloaked in a darkness punctuated only by the sinister glow of the creature's eyes. The forest around them had fallen eerily silent, as if all life had retreated to avoid the malice that unfolded within its heart. Alistair, his breathing heavy and his arms aching from the relentless combat, used the growing darkness as a brief respite to gather his thoughts and strength. The air grew colder, and the mist that had been a mere wisp at his feet now swirled around him with renewed vigor, as though feeding off the Morrighul's anger and pain. The creature's movements became more cautious, its attacks less frequent but more cunning. The Morrighul, its voice a mixture of fury and mockery, broke the silence. "You fight well, human. But how long can you last against the night? Here in my domain, the darkness is my ally, and it consumes all." Alistair wiped sweat and grime from his brow, squinting into the shadows where the creature's form flickered like a bad dream. "Then let the night witness your defeat," he retorted, his voice steady despite the fatigue that tugged at his limbs. He knew he couldn't allow fear to seep into his heart, for fear was what the Morrighul fed upon. Drawing on the tactical knowledge passed down by his grandfather, Alistair began to use the environment to his advantage. He moved back towards a narrow clearing he had noticed earlier, where the moonlight broke through the dense canopy. If he could lure the Morrighul into the light, he might gain the upper hand. The Morrighul, sensing his intentions, laughed, a sound that sent shivers through the undergrowth. "Clever, clever," it hissed as it followed Alistair into the clearing. But not clever enough. In the clearing, under the wan light of the moon, the true horror of the Morrighul was more evident. Its form was fluid, almost smoky at the edges, as if it were part of the night itself. Its eyes burned brighter with malice, and it moved with a grace that belied its monstrous nature. Alistair stood his ground in the center of the moonlit clearing, his blade ready. As the Morrighul advanced, he noticed it moved differently in the light, its form slightly more corporeal, its movements marginally slower. Seizing the moment, Alistair attacked, his blade cutting a bright arc through the night air. The Morrighul dodged swiftly but not swiftly enough to avoid a shallow cut along its arm. The creature recoiled, its blood, dark and ichorous, spilling onto the leaf-strewn ground. It fixed Alistair with a glare that could freeze blood, its wound sizzling as if the silver in the blade caused it great pain. "Silver," Alistair breathed, understanding flashing in his mind. His grandfather's journals had mentioned the creature's aversion to silver, but only now did the full significance become clear. With renewed vigor, Alistair pressed on, each strike aimed with more precision, exploiting this newfound weakness. The Morrighul became more erratic, its attacks desperate as it tried to escape the relentless assault. Alistair, drawing on reserves he hadn't known he possessed, matched the creature's ferocity with a calm determination. Every slash of his blade was a reminder of what he was fighting for, his family, his village, his very soul. As the night deepened, the battle reached a fever pitch, with Alistair pushing the Morrighul back step by step. The creature's smoky form flickered under the assault, its edges fraying, its movements becoming sluggish. It was losing strength, and Alistair knew that the moment to end this was nearing. With a final, powerful shout, Alistair lunged forward, his blade aimed at the creature's heart. The Morrighul raised its arms in a futile attempt to defend itself, its eyes wide with fear for the first time. The blade struck true, and with a terrible cry that echoed through the woods like a death knell, the creature's form shattered into 1,000 shadows, dissipating into the night air. Panting, Alistair stood alone in the clearing, his blade dripping with dark ichor. He had won, but the victory was heavy on his soul. He knew the night was not over yet, and the true depth of the darkness in Eldermore might yet reveal itself. But for now, he had reclaimed his courage and his land from the shadow of the Morrighul. As the dissipating echoes of the Morrighul's cry faded into the night, Alistair remained vigilant, his senses sharpened by the battle's intensity. He knew that defeating the Morrighul in combat was only part of the struggle. To ensure the safety of his village, he needed to find the lair where it dwelled and eradicate any lingering trace of its dark presence. Guided by the faint light of the moon and the knowledge gleaned from his grandfather's journals, Alistair ventured deeper into the heart of Eldermore woods. The forest around him seemed to sigh with a silent, oppressive dread, the trees standing like somber sentinels watching his every move. As he moved through the thick underbrush, the ground beneath his feet became increasingly uneven. Moss-covered rocks and gnarled roots made the path treacherous. The air grew colder, a sign that he was nearing the core of the Morrighul's domain, where the veil between the earthly and the ethereal was thin. After what felt like hours, Alistair arrived at a clearing much larger than the previous one, enclosed by towering oaks and shadowed by thick, intertwining branches that blocked out most of the sky. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone structure, partially crumbled and overgrown with ivy and moss. It had the appearance of a forgotten shrine or temple, its origin lost to time. A cold, hollow feeling settled in Alistair's stomach as he approached the structure. This had to be the lair of the Morrighul, the source of its power. The air was thick with a palpable darkness, and the silence was so complete that even the sound of his own breathing seemed loud. Drawing his blade, Alistair stepped cautiously toward the stone entrance. The doorway was framed by old runes, some of which he recognized from his grandfather's journals. They spoke of bindings and seals, ancient magic crafted to contain something unspeakable. Inside, the lair was shrouded in darkness. Alistair took a deep breath, whispering another incantation for protection before lighting a small torch he had prepared from his pack. The flickering light revealed a chamber hollowed out from the stone, its walls carved with more runes and filled with relics and bones, trophies from past victims, no doubt. At the far end of the chamber stood an altar, upon which lay a collection of objects that seemed to pulsate with a residual dark energy. There were personal belongings, likely taken from those the Morrighul had preyed upon, and a set of ancient tomes bound in unfamiliar materials that Alistair dared not touch without proper knowledge. Knowing that these objects held the essence of the Morrighul's power, Alistair approached the altar. He placed the blade upon each item, reciting a banishment spell designed to cleanse and consecrate. As he did so, the air in the chamber grew tense, as if resisting the intrusion of light and purity into such a profane space. With each word of power spoken, the objects on the altar began to deteriorate, disintegrating into dust as the corrupt energy holding them together was undone. The chamber shook slightly, stones falling from the ceiling as if the very lair protested its cleansing. Finally, as the last of the objects turned to dust, a profound stillness settled over the place. The oppressive darkness seemed to lift, and the air felt clearer, lighter. Alistair stood back, watching cautiously for any sign of lingering danger. When none came, he allowed himself a moment of relief. Exhausted but resolute, Alistair took one last look around the lair, ensuring that nothing of the Morrighul's essence remained. Satisfied that his work was done, he left the chamber, the torchlight casting long shadows as he exited the lair. The night air felt fresher, the oppressive weight of dread lifted. As he made his way back through the forest, the first hints of dawn tinted the eastern sky. The creatures of the woods began to stir, their sounds a natural chorus that was absent on his way in. Alistair's heart felt lighter with each step towards home, knowing that he had faced the darkness of Elder Moor and emerged victorious, the legacy of his grandfather upheld and the safety of Gerla secured, for now. Emerging from the depths of Eldermoor Woods as dawn cast its first gentle light across the land, Alistair felt both the weariness and triumph of a night spent battling darkness. However, his relief was short-lived, as he approached the edge of the woods and spotted a chilling sight. Gathered in a half-circle near the tree line were figures cloaked in the remnants of night, their features obscured but their presence unmistakably sinister. The Morrighul, though vanquished in one form, had not been alone. Its kin, lesser spirits of the wood, drawn to the Morrighul's dark power, now stood before Alistair. They were wraiths of the forest, creatures that thrived on fear and decay, and with their master's fall, they were unbound and ravenous. Alistair tightened his grip on his blade, his body tensing for another fight. The forest behind him rustled softly, a reminder of the eyes that watched and the spirits that whispered on the wind. He was tired, his limbs heavy with exhaustion, but the safety of Gerla spurred him onward. "Back to the shadows from whence you came," he shouted, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I will not let you spread your corruption to the village." The wraiths hissed, a sound like wind through dry leaves, and began to converge slowly on Alistair. They moved with eerie coordination, as if driven by a singular, malevolent will. As they drew closer, the air grew colder, and the faint light of dawn seemed to dim, shrouded by an unnatural mist. Remembering the lessons from his grandfather's journals, Alistair recalled that while such spirits were less formidable than the Morrighul, they were many and could overwhelm with sheer numbers. He knew he could not withstand a prolonged battle against so many. He needed to strike decisively. As the first of the wraiths lunged, Alistair ducked low, swinging his blade in a wide arc. The silver-edged sword, still imbued with the rites of protection and strength, cut through the spectral form, dissipating it into a cloud of shadow. One by one, the wraiths attacked, and one by one, Alistair countered, turning their own momentum against them, his movements a dance of desperation and determination. Yet, with each fallen wraith, the effort took its toll. Alistair felt his strength waning, his swings becoming slower, heavier. Just as he felt he might be overwhelmed, a shout rang out from the direction of the village. Looking up, Alistair saw figures approaching with torches and weapons, his fellow villagers, led by the elders, who had come to stand by him. Heartened by their arrival, Alistair found a new surge of energy. "To me," he called, rallying his neighbors. Together, they formed a line, the villagers' torches held high, casting light that seemed to burn and repel the wraiths. With the villagers at his side, Alistair pressed forward, his blade a beacon of silver light in the morning gloom. The battle shifted, and slowly, the tide began to turn. The wraiths, unable to withstand the combined might and light of the villagers united in courage and purpose, began to falter. Their forms, already less substantial in the growing light of day, started to waver, the darkness that gave them shape thinning and breaking apart. With one final, concerted effort, Alistair and the villagers pushed forward. Alistair's blade, guided by desperate, tired hands, struck true and deep into the heart of the remaining wraiths, their cries fading into whispers as they vanished, leaving behind nothing but the morning mist and the lingering scent of cold fire. As the last of the wraiths dissipated, the villagers erupted into cheers, their faces lit by the glow of dawn and the fire of victory. They clapped Alistair on the back, their relief palpable in their tired smiles and joyful shouts. But Alistair knew, even as he shared in their celebration, that this victory was but one night's work in the ongoing struggle against the darkness lurking in Eldermore Woods. The battle was won, but the war, the eternal vigil against the dark, would continue. The morning sun crested over the horizon, bathing the village of Gerla in a soft, golden light that belied the night's harrowing events. The villagers slowly dispersed to their homes, their hearts lighter with the knowledge that they had faced the darkness together and prevailed. But for Alistair, the dawn brought no rest. There was one final task he needed to undertake to ensure the Morrighul would not rise again. Gathered in his modest home, Alistair, along with Elder Hamish and Elder Bridget, pored over the ancient tomes and scrolls that he had retrieved from the Morrighul's lair. They were searching for something specific, a true name. According to his grandfather's teachings, knowing the true name of a creature gave one dominion over it, binding its essence and barring it from the earthly realm. The true name, it holds the creature's power, binds its will, anchors its spirit, Elder Bridget explained, her fingers tracing the lines of a particularly old parchment. If we can speak it rightly, we can seal the Morrighul away for good. The task was daunting. The writings were cryptic, the language ancient, a mixture of old Scots and arcane symbols that twisted across the pages like dark vines. Alistair felt a pang of doubt. Could they truly find the name that had eluded so many before them? As the sun climbed higher, Alistair's eyes were drawn to a passage in one of the tomes, a shadowed script that seemed to pulse with a darker ink. He leaned closer, the words coming into focus, revealing a story of a spirit, born of earth and shadow, that had been bound by a name spoken by the ancients. Here, Alistair said, his voice steadied despite the fatigue that clung to his bones. It speaks of a binding, a naming. The name, it's here, hidden in the text, woven into the very tale of its origin. Elder Hamish leaned over to look, his eyes narrowing as he deciphered the script. You're right, lad. It's a ritual of sealing. We need to prepare, gather the village at the stone circle. It's a place of power, old as these woods, maybe older. There, we shall speak the name and bind the Morrighul. The village stone circle was set on a small hill overlooking Gerla, composed of standing stones placed by unknown hands many generations ago. As the villagers gathered, forming a ring around the elders and Alistair, there was a sense of solemnity, of history repeating itself through the ages. Alistair stepped into the center of the circle, the ancient blade in his hand, and the tomes spread out before him. He began the ritual, his voice echoing off the stones, strong and clear. Elder Bridget and Elder Hamish joined in, their voices weaving with his, the incantation rising into the sky. Finally, with the power of the old words humming through the air, Alistair spoke the true name of the Morrighul. It rolled off his tongue, a sound that was both a word and a melody, a power that seemed to shake the very earth and stir the winds. The air shimmered, the atmosphere charged with energy as if the world itself responded to the call of the true name. A deep, resonating silence followed, profound and complete. When Alistair finally lowered his blade, the feeling of oppression that had clung to the edges of the woods had lifted. The air was clearer, the sky a purer shade of blue, and the sun's rays warmer than they had been. Turning to face his fellow villagers, Alistair saw the relief and newfound respect in their eyes. They had faced the darkness together, and they had prevailed through unity and strength, guided by the wisdom of the past. As long as we remember the true name, as long as we keep the rites alive, the Morrighul will not return, Elder Hamish declared, his voice resonant with the promise of peace. The villagers nodded, their faces marked by the trials they had endured, but also by the triumph they had achieved. They were no longer just farmers, weavers, or smiths, they were guardians of Gerla, keepers of secrets and old magics, bound by the power of a name and the strength of their community. As the last echoes of the ancient incantation faded into the wind, the people of Gerla lingered around the stone circle, their faces reflecting the weight of their shared ordeal and the light of a new dawn. The air felt fresher, the woods less ominous, as if the land itself breathed easier with the Morrighul's binding. Alistair stood amongst his neighbors, feeling a profound connection to the village and the ancient landscape that had shaped their lives. Elder Bridget approached Alistair, placing a weathered hand upon his shoulder. "You've done well, lad. Not just in bravery, but in leadership. You've helped us remember who we are, what we can achieve together. But remember, the peace may be ours now, but vigilance must be our constant companion." Alistair nodded, understanding the gravity of his role. "I'll guard the lore, keep the stories alive so that future generations know how to protect themselves. The Morrighul is bound, but it is not destroyed." As the villagers started to disperse, returning to their homes and fields, Alistair walked back to his farm, feeling the familiar pull of the earth beneath his feet. The land that had been a source of livelihood was now also a sacred trust. He passed the fields and the thickets, each step reinforcing his resolve to maintain the balance between the village and the wild woods of Eldermore. Upon reaching his farmhouse, Alistair found his family waiting, their faces alight with relief and pride. His wife, Marin, embraced him tightly, while his children clung to his legs, their voices filled with excitement and a touch of awe. "Father, the elders say you've chased away the shadows," his youngest daughter said, her eyes wide with wonder. "Aye, but it was all of us, love." "The whole village," Alistair replied, ruffling her hair. "We each hold the light against the dark, together." That night, Alistair sat by the fire with his family, recounting the events not as tales of fear, but as lessons of courage and unity. He spoke of each villager's role, emphasizing the community's strength. Outside, the woods of Eldermore whispered in the wind, no longer a voice of threat but a murmur of an uneasy truce. Days turned into weeks, and life in Gerlach resumed its normal rhythm. Alistair spent his days tending to his farm and his evenings with the elders, learning more about the ancient texts and the lore of their land. He took it upon himself to patrol the edges of the woods, a silent guardian keeping watch over the fragile peace. But Alistair knew that the true test of peace was in its sustaining. He began to teach the younger villagers about the woods, showing them the signs of the wild, the ways to recognize and respect the boundaries that had been set by their forebears. He taught his own children the stories and spells that had protected them, ensuring that the knowledge would pass through generations. On the anniversary of the Morrighul's binding, Gerlach held a festival. It was a celebration of light, with lanterns hung from every home and around the stone circle. The villagers gathered, sharing food and stories, their voices blending into the night, a tapestry of joy and communal memory. As Alistair looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They had not only survived the darkness but had turned their ordeal into a testament to human spirit and resilience. The festival would become an annual tradition in Gerlach, a celebration of their victory and a reminder of the vigil they must keep. As the night drew to a close, Alistair stood by the stone circle, looking out into the dark woods. He whispered a thanks to his ancestors for their guidance and made a silent vow to continue their legacy of guardianship. In Gerlach, the tale of Alistair and the Morrighul would be told through the ages, a story of courage, unity, and the eternal vigilance that kept the darkness at bay, safeguarding the light of their community.